Meditations with Ryan Slomak.
Happy freaking New Year, everybody. It is 2025, and if you're listening to this on the drop date, it is January 1st. That means the clocks are reset for everybody. It is a new start, and it is your time to go rock the year. 365 days to make your dreams come true, and I really hope you do. This is the Meditations Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Zlomek, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you starting your year with me. Thanks. It's just joyous. Did we watch the ball drop together? Maybe we didn't, but here we are now, and I truly appreciate you. This is a show dedicated to making space for conversation with interesting people, and I have the joy every other week of bringing just people who intrigue me onto the show to kind of share their stories and see what we can learn from one another. On today's show, I've got Chris Clemens. Chris is a very proud Western New Yorker. I'm a very proud Central New Yorker, so we work in tandem together. But more important than that, he is known kind of around the internet as a self-publishing guru. He created exploringupstate.com, which became an extremely popular blog between 2012 and 2021, just looking at history, food, tourism, all around upstate New York that you could just drive to if you were local. But he's kind of changed gears a little bit. He is somebody who's in recovery. He's a former addict and has created Non-Rockaholic. Non-Rockaholic is a dedicated blog and social media presence that showcases non-alcoholic beverages at bars, restaurants, packaged ones that you can order online or buy at your local grocery store. And he also goes out of his way to create meetups for people who are interested in connecting with one another in a sober context. So if you're unfamiliar with the term dry January, a time to just kind of reset and maybe clear the system out from a little too much partying over the last few months with Thanksgiving and the holidays, this is the episode for you. So without further ado, we're going to hear from Chris, hear his story, and learn about dry January. Here is Chris Clemens. Chris, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Ryan.
We're gonna, so for listeners, we're not actually recording this moments before you're listening. That would be crazy since this episode drops at midnight 30. But like as we're recording, the new year is directly in front of us. As listeners are listening to this, the new year is here. And I'm just kind of curious, as you're wrapping up your 2024 and looking to 2025, is there anything that you want to like wish or create into the universe and good vibes moving forward?
Yeah, I think I would like way more serenity. Not to immediately quote a Seinfeld episode like within minutes of starting this, but serenity now, like this moment would be real nice. 2024 was kind of hectic in a lot of different ways. I suspect that 2025 is probably going to be similar, but in my personal life, I'm definitely going to be seeking more opportunities to relax a bit.
Awesome. I support you, and I think I'll join you in that as well. We're gonna, this is gonna be a conversation where we talk about self-publishing and self-promotion and sobriety and supporting people and finding comfortable spaces. But I think it's just, I guess, to get this right out the gate, like, I notice addictions in myself in regards to like work, like I've got to do these things or whatever, and I'm right there with you that, 2025, maybe I'll do a better job of finding that balance.
I've often said, I mean, since I got sober, balance has been like the most commonly recurring thing that I struggle with, recognizing that I kind of swing between extremes, and I recognize balance as the thing that I just passed, like on my way to the other extreme. Like, a few weeks ago, I'm like, damn, was that what happiness was? And then making a concerted effort to swing back towards the other direction and again missing it and going, oh wait, I think it was back there. But balance is probably something that's not static anyway, and we're always going to be achieving it in some way.
Well, let's we're gonna get to this idea of balance and equilibrium soon enough. But let's I want to start off kind of talking about you and your sort of backstory. Um, From what I understand, you are a born and bred Western New Yorker. Um,
You
is
got
that,
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
Never left Rochester.
I love it. And I know that your dad worked for Kodak. And I'm kind of curious about like what was like the young Chris like growing up in Western New York.
We grew up on this. So I grew up in Penfield in the suburbs east of Rochester, and the house that we had was like an old farmhouse with a ton of like forest land behind us. We had a large grassy area for a yard, but beyond that, it just seemed like miles and miles and miles of forest. And now, as an adult, knowing where I grew up, that it wasn't miles and miles, it was much smaller. But as a kid, you kind of have this notion that there's wilderness and forever land back there and something to explore. So I think as a kid, that's what we did. Like we rode bikes. We got into little innocent trouble here and there. But I was always, when I was telling whenever I have told my story in about addiction and substance abuse and recovery, I often will start it talking about how I struggled at that age. I was always way smaller than all the other kids and was never, always picked last for the kickball team. Had asthma, had glasses in fourth grade. Like I just thought that I was set up to like never be cool. And that was something that I was aware of at the time. I remember going down in elementary school, they like introduce you to all the instruments to see like which one you want to play. And I wanted to play the bass. And I swear to you, Ryan, I still remember the look on this guy's face. I remember his name. I remember everything about him. And he didn't know how to tell me that there was no way that I could hold the bass, that I was just way too small. So I started with cello, and I would lug this cello up onto the minibus. And like it was in retrospect, all of those things are easily overcome, and there are other people with way larger struggles, but I definitely remember at the time feeling like I'm not very cool. And wanting to figure out how to fit with the other kids. So that was definitely an early part of my story that set things in motion after that.
Two things. One is that as you're talking about playing bass as somebody who is vertically challenged, I think is the term. Like I'm just picturing like a Looney Tunes cartoon where you're like panning across the entire band, and then you've got the last guy who's like on three step ladders, like holding the bass.
That probably would have been it. Barely holding the tune.
And number two is, I please correct me if I'm wrong, but like one of the things that I'm interested in is you've got a really cool relationship with reading and writing.
Mm-hmm.
And in another interview I listened to, you talked about sort of reading like the travelogues of John Steinbeck,
Yeah.
like early on and kind of being influenced by those types of books. And I'm kind of curious about like as a kid, like what sort of books did you find yourself gravitating to or really like immersed in?
It's so funny, man. I don't think I've thought about this question or this in years, but I know the answer immediately, because it was a turning point for me, and it was a turning point in my life to discover new worlds. I remember, I think, I'm 45. I was born in 1979. So in the early 90s, or in the late 80s, I found skateboarding. In the early 90s, that was a part of what I did. I was into skate culture and music, and um, again, probably getting a little bit of trouble doing things that we shouldn't have been doing with skateboards. But Nirvana was a band that I really liked. And I think I read the book Come As You Are. It was just like me trying to like learn about a band that I like. And I realized like I'm enjoying learning about this stuff. There was no internet at the time. So learning about heroes of mine or things that I really enjoyed, it was books. Um, I remember my grandfather somewhat investing into the fact that I like books, gave me this book called Religions of the World. It was this nicotine stained old tiny paperback that just kind of gave a very brief rundown of all these different ideas. And I remember reading it thinking like Taoism and like all of these other religions ideas. Like I was raised Catholic, and I was familiar with Judaism, but I didn't really know what it was. And these books kind of exposed me to all of these ideas that probably were very commonplace, and the average person might have been familiar with them, but they were all very brand new to me. Um, and I kind of fell deeply in love with reading as um, maybe, I guess, as an escape. When I think about like those John Steinbeck books, um, or like some of the travel type books, like the Beat era, Jack Kerouac, that kind of stuff, like on the road. It was kind of like this um, living vicariously through somebody else who was experiencing things that they had never experienced before and didn't know they existed. And that was something that I connected with for some reason at a pretty young age, like, 12, 13, 14 years old. It was probably the time that I was discovering that stuff.
That's awesome. And like, what about the writing process? Like, were you somebody who was journaling, or did you have some sort of like way in order to like sort of practice putting words to paper in a way that was beneficial to you, or did that come later?
That came later. I think, again, music has always played a huge role in my life, and the Doors were a group that I was paying a lot of attention to at that time. So I tried my hand at poetry, and I actually wrote a whole bunch of poetry. And it was me trying to explore the stuff in my head that didn't really make sense, but it seemed like it was there. And actually, I think, man, I haven't thought about this stuff in a long time. I started a poetry club in Webster High School. Um, I kind of forgot all about that. So yeah, so I was kind of trying stuff to see what felt right, and I was reading a lot of from a lot of I guess different, not just types of writers, but different eras. And I was trying to get all these confused thoughts in my head out and make sense of them.
I love it. Well, you eventually went to college, got a job, did a bunch of things, and then started Explore Upstate, which is like a really really cool resource. Like I gotta tell you, Chris, like I'm somebody who prides myself on like waking up in the morning and being like, all right, I'm gonna go to this town and I'm gonna have lunch at this place and
Yeah.
I'm gonna explore that culture. And then having started to delve into the way in which you do it, like I've got the biggest imposter syndrome as like a tourism consultant. It's great. Like I am in the presence of somebody who takes upstate narratives to like a whole new world. And I'm kind of curious about that project. Like tell us about your blog, your website, your Explore Upstate movement, I'd call it, like, and how that kind of got kicked off.
That it I think, like a lot of creative projects, there was no single moment. There was probably a series of moments that led up to it. I I was in a conversation with a buddy of mine, and we were talking about specifically religion and spirituality in upstate New York, and how there's a ton of really, really, I'll say, intriguing history that took place relative to spirituality and religion within an hour's drive of Rochester. And why is it that people will spend thousands of dollars and take a plane ride, 12 hours across the world to go see, whatever, but they haven't gone to like Palmyra, where Mormonism started. Like, why? It's like 20 minutes away. And why wouldn't someone go do that? But instead, we'll go on this huge long trek to go see something elsewhere. And there was a couple things where we talked about it. We were like, yeah, how come we've never gone to see like the grave of whoever?
Frederick
And
Douglass.
right, yeah. At this time, we were in this conversation. It was really specific to religion. So we were thinking of all these things. So like the Seventh Day Adventist movement started as the result of um, the Millerites were a group not far from present day Newark, New York, that believed that Christ was going to show up and remove them all from the earth and ascend to heaven. And that night was known as the Great Anticipation. It was October 22nd, 1844, maybe. We'll see. We'll check later and see how close that is. The following day is known as the Great Disappointment because it never happened, which we know, of course. And they sort of split up and try to decide like where they had gone wrong in their foretelling. And as a result, multiple religions were born. One of them was the Seventh Day Adventist group. And we were like, man, like that's serious history. Like, why would we go to Boston to see like where the like the Boston Tea Party took place, but we wouldn't go to the actual barn where Seventh Day Adventism was born? And it's like a half an hour from here. So we created this list of religious and spiritual places in upstate New York, and we started driving around every weekend and started telling those stories in a blog called Exploring the Burned Over District. And when you start to look at the history of spirituality and what was became the Second Great Awakening, it's very closely tied in with civil rights movements, abolition, women's rights movements, and all the things that were happening specific to the Erie Canal. And I started thinking, like, I really would love to be able to tell some of these other stories. And that project kind of morphed into Exploring Upstate, where it was me not just doing religion anymore, but it was even finding like the best hot dog, or one of my favorite stories is the only two-story brick outhouse in the United States is in the village of Phelps in the Finger Lakes between Syracuse and Rochester. I've got a friend who grew up right in Phelps, and smart dude who went to Syracuse. He's now a newscaster. Super smart dude. And I said, oh, you're from Phelps, you know about the two-story outhouse? And he had never heard of it, and he grew up there. And I'd be like, that was the whole thing about Exploring Upstate for me, was like, there's all this stuff in our backyard that we never pay any attention to, and we spend all this time going on these lavish vacations. There's so much cool stuff in our backyard. And that's really what it was about, was telling those stories and helping people connect to those things.
So you were running that pretty consistently from 2012 to 2021, if I understand. Um,
Very.
and like, what
It
does
was
that
exhausting.
that's what I want to talk about is like what does that consistency look like? Like how does one structure their time to ensure that they are able to explore a place, make sure that they've got everything figured out to get enough content to kind of, make a post worthwhile, and then determine your publication dates and whatever. Like what was your sort of routine in your way of getting that content created?
Essentially, every night I would read something, even if it was just a Wikipedia page for the town of Groveland or something. And I would try to see like what famous people were born here, what famous people died here, who might be buried there. Is there any unique house there? And then I would go to the next town and I would read through it. And then I had always had this list of things that I wanted to do. And as you can imagine, upstate New York is a huge place. The list was always really long. And I would think, what am I going to do next weekend? And instead of me saying, what can I do? What should I do? I don't know what I want to do. I would just go to this list and I would pick something. And I would think, I think I'm up for a 2 hour drive. So I would find something based in a region that was a couple hours away, and I would go and I would grab a friend and say, hey, I'm going to go and find this sign that's about 3 hours away, but it marks the exact geographic center of New York State. Do you want to go? And I'm very blessed to have a few, there aren't many, but a few people who would go, absolutely. There are many people who will like take an entire Saturday of like 7 hours of driving just for that. But I'm very lucky that I've found a few that are totally up for it. What ended up happening, like in 2019, it started to get really overwhelming and stressful because I want to grow and I want to do more. And I'm only one person, and it's a big state. And what I was finding, and you mentioned it in your question, it totally hit the problem right on the head. Was I was discovering that I was visiting these places for the intention of documenting them and sharing them with other people, and I would be spending all my time making sure that I got a portrait video for an Insta story and a horizontal photo for the header of the blog post that would go up, and make sure that I got this shot and this shot. And I realized that I was spending more time worrying about documenting it than I was actually being there, and being there myself. And I, again, back to that thing that we started with, I don't know how to balance real well. And I didn't know how to scale back to balance myself. And then COVID happened and the world like shut down. Everything shut right down. And I honestly, dude, it felt good to shut down. Like it felt good. It felt good. Like the only responsibility we had in life at that time was to not die and to not transfer a disease to someone else. It felt so good that that was the only responsibility. And I think I kind of leaned into that a little bit and realized like I've done some cool stuff. I've gone hard on a lot of stuff, and I've built some stuff that I'm proud of. The Exploring Upstate brand is something that I really love, and it's very dear to my heart. But it was tough to continue. Um, I don't know if I'm sure you remember in 2020, every day that you open up the news, there was difficult things that we were facing. Uh, I sometimes now think back to how insane it is that every single day I was checking the news to see how many people died that day. Like at the time, it was perfectly normal, but right now, that seems insanely morbid. And that I was constantly surrounded by really difficult news. People were dying at the hands, unnecessarily at the hands of police. The presidential election was very heavy and difficult to deal with. Um, it felt more and more difficult to interrupt those news feeds with things like, check out this cool grape juice I found in the Finger Lakes. You know, like it felt like that wasn't important, and that I needed to step back and let some other people share their voices, and I could just relax for a bit. And that's kind of what I did.
I think it's a really interesting perspective, just in the sense that, like, I didn't have the privilege of discovering Explore Upstate until recently, but like just the fact that, like I know you had a pretty substantial following, you had a good amount of traction on
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
and a lot of what you also demonstrated though was that the world may be difficult. Sometimes you may have, times where you can't have that elaborate Italian vacation, But if you're an upstate New Yorker and you check out my site, you can go and find something cool and historic that's outside where you're not going to worry about harming anybody. So there's just something interesting that happened that I guess that brings up in me, where thinking about the idea that like as the creator, sometimes we're so in the trenches of things that like we
Yeah.
can't benefit from the actual content that we're developing. And I understand the irony that like right now we're both taking time out of our own day to record a podcast. Um, but on the flip side too, like when we are willing to be in the trenches and create that stuff, and sometimes, at the peril of our own I don't know, successes or mental successes later on, there's tons of other people who are able to go and look at those resources and find so much benefit from them, especially in a time like COVID, where like you're starting to peter out, but there's like other people who are like, I need to figure out something cool to do with my kids. And
Yeah,
like, oh
yeah,
my God, I
yeah.
live 15 minutes away from an outhouse. Who doesn't love outhouse jokes? Like I think there's just a really interesting kind of push-pull struggle there that needs to be acknowledged.
There definitely was. And again, push pull is, I mean, right on topic with balance. And my entire life, I have not been able to find balance. But I think, and you're right. Like I just mentioned, like it seemed really difficult to try to interrupt really important news feeds with something that seemed trivial. But in retrospect, um, trivial was such a nice break at that time. I mean, that's why I binged Tiger King. Like it was stupid and dumb, and I didn't have to think about it. And I'm in retrospect, I can't believe I actually watched it. But at the time, I loved having that break. And I think that's why. But I think I was burning out. And I also noticed that there was a ton more people doing upstate New York travel content. And I was like, maybe I'm not really needed here anymore. Um, just to be very clear, maybe I'm not needed very much in the upstate New York travel area because there's so many other people doing so many other great things. And maybe I can relax a little bit and let some other people enjoy this. But you're right. There was a lot of people who very much enjoyed it and look forward to it. And I honestly, I still hear from those people. Um, it's weird that I could be recognized in cities around upstate New York on the street. So that is a testament to the fact that people knew me and liked what I did. And I will always cherish that because I'm honored to be able to be in a position to do it. But I felt like it was time to let somebody else do it.
I love it. So
Um,
before we shift away from Explore Upstate, I just want to stay here for a little bit longer,
yeah.
and just kind of talk about the inherent, like some of the narratives that you discovered through your travelogue writing journey.
Mm-hmm.
Like the one I have up right here is, spending an entire day in Syracuse just trying to find all the places to drink tea, right? Like,
Yeah.
and there's different sort of narratives you picked up, but I guess what I'm curious, like, I always hate the like, what was your favorite? But like, as we're talking about this and we're thinking about like, let's say food, discovering
Mm-hmm.
food in upstate New York, like, are there any sort of like food narratives that you still today are really excited that you discovered courtesy of this Exploring Upstate project?
Yeah, I think um, so. We talked about me growing up as a Kodak kid. I grew up as a blue collar kid, was never really introduced to super fine dining until I was an adult. And that's no slight on my parents at all. It was the way it was. We weren't a fine dining family. But if you start looking around at all the foods that were generated in upstate New York that became famous, it's kind of all blue collar stuff. And I realized like I fit right in. And honestly, I'd rather have a plate of wings than a super fancy $200 steak dinner at some fancy steakhouse. I'm not saying I won't enjoy it or appreciate it, but I realized I feel at home here, surrounded by people who are trying to achieve comfort. Probably my favorite food stories are out of Utica. Utica is such a fascinating place for so many reasons. But one of the primary reasons is the food. I don't feel like a lot of people realize that. Uh, well, so Utica at one point was a powerhouse of a small city and fell on tough times for a number of different reasons. And one of the solutions they came up with to try to repopulate their city was they opened their doors to immigrants from all different countries. That was something that started in the 70s. They had almost, certainly not to the same extent, but kind of like Detroit, they had like blocks with just empty houses. And what they said was, hey, you want to come here from wherever, Laos, wherever, Ukraine, that's your house now. It's free, but you better keep it up. And suddenly they've got all of these tiny little markets from all of these little different countries. And if you go and look, it's like a little international food city in Utica. And I'm totally fascinated by that. And if you talk to the average person from upstate New York and you say, hey, you should visit Utica, they're like, what? Why? But then when you start running down all the reasons, they're like, actually, I guess that sounds pretty cool. So I think that's Utica is probably the one that I've always thought of as being like, man, they're doing it. It's cool. They're not making any what's the phrase I'm looking for? They're not pretending to be anything other than they are. They're just living life and eating the food that they love on a daily basis and sharing it with whoever wants it.
Well, it's interesting. So, both my shout out to my two parents who both went to Utica College, so they're super Utica fans. But I just had a really interesting experience a few weeks ago where I was picking up a pinball machine and talking to the lady
Of
who's
course.
of course, talking to the lady whose house I was at, and like making small talk, and she was retired, and I was like, "Oh, what did you do?" She's like, "Oh, I sold pizza dough." I was like, "Oh, you sold pizza dough?" She's like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like, I worked for a
Very
company."
specific job.
Yeah, very specific job. And I'm in my brain, I'm like, what does that even look like? Like, and her job was that she was a sales rep for a company that made and exported pizza dough out of Utica. And like there was like a whole hub, and like I learned about this whole distribution network that existed where like pizza all over the place from like New York to Florida wouldn't exist without this distribution network coming out of
Yeah.
Utica. Um,
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the second oldest pizza shop in New York State is in Utica. So yeah, if you think about like all of the ties to all the food that we love, Utica's got some cool stuff. And again, like I don't know if not to get super introspective, but I know I talked earlier about kind of feeling like an underdog as a kid. Like I think there's probably some element of who I am that I identify well with the underdog or the one that gets looked past or something. And Utica is kind of that. And honestly, a lot of parts of upstate New York are kind of that way.
Well, I think that fits into the grit that is what I love about upstate New York, which is that like, I mean, as we're talking right now, Syracuse is anticipating its first major snowstorm. And I'm having a conversation with a colleague earlier today who's like, "Yep, I'm gonna go to bed at 8 o'clock." And I was like, "Why?" It's like, "Well, it's getting dark and it feels really late. So like I'm already," I was like, "No, man, like the spirit of us is that like we are going to push through whatever our biology requires. And if like we're looking outside and it looks like it's midnight, but it's 7 o'clock, you better believe I'm starting another project and I'm doing the next thing." And I feel like that just inherent angst and that pushback and that, to your point, underdog mentality is like felt in different parts of the cities that I love in this state. And I just do one more shout out to your blog. Like one of the things that I love about it is that as I'm looking and I'm reading the articles that you've put together, like that spirit and that welcomeness, that like, hey, these are these experiences I'm having. anybody can go and check them out. I'm just looking at them through a lens that maybe you've never seen before. I think that like that beautiful mixture of grit and like open arms is like what makes your project really successful.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate that you're able to see that, because that's exactly what I experienced. That upstate New York kind of has a survivor mentality. Like those snowstorms and our winters are kind of something like we've survived. Like it's like a badge of honor. Like we can do this. And I think it does come through in our food, because some of it's a lot of comfort food. Garbage plates, chicken wings, chicken riggies. It's heavy comfort food that feels good.
Let's switch gears, and I'm gonna apologize for totally taking a 90-degree turn on this, but you do a new project now called Non-Rockaholic, where you're looking at non-alcoholic options at bars, and you're quite frankly an advocate for that. But obviously, you didn't just decide to start that project without any sort of history that brought you here. And I'm wondering if we can turn back the clocks to the late 1900s, as my students would say. Um, and kind of talk about your experience with addiction, and what brought you sort of past that to sobriety, and then what you're doing now. We'll kind of let's start back at the late 1900s with Chris Clemens.
We'll pretend we're in black and white for this audio episode. When I was right around that time that I was, talking about discovering books, and Nirvana and the Doors, and realizing that there were all of these new things out there, was also a time that I was discovering substances and playing around with drinking a little bit here and there when we get away with it, and smoking a little weed. And um, uh, I wouldn't say that I was going super hard at 12, but that's kind of when we were discovering these things, and discovering that I kind of liked it. And again, balance is not a strong suit of mine, and we started seeking all of those opportunities to party, as often as we could. When I say we, I mean the friends that I was keeping at the time. And again, we started getting in trouble more often, and rabble rousing and doing stuff that we shouldn't have. I'm not saying that at 13 years old I was holding up convenience stores at gunpoint, because I wasn't. For the most part, I was just a stupid kid from the suburbs who was getting a little bit of trouble and doing things that I probably shouldn't have. But as time went on, I really just wanted to be stoned as much as I could. And at that age, drugs are probably a little bit easier to procure than alcohol. But I had some older friends who could get beer, and Jack Daniels was one that I always liked, and I could get the weed and the acid, and we would party as much as possible. And again, people knew. I would get in trouble with the police. There were moments where my parents knew what was going on, and God bless them, they had no idea what to do with me. They wanted to do the right thing and help. And how do you help somebody who doesn't want help? I think teachers and administrators at the school where I went, I think they probably knew. But again, if I'm not breaking any rules, I'm just sort of a kid who looks like he's going off the tracks a little. But I did end up breaking more and more rules. And on May 3rd, 1996, I got in some trouble that I could no longer talk my way out of. There was no charm and wit and apology that was going to take me out of that one. I got in trouble in school, watching, or not me watching, but walking out of the school while all of my classmates watched out of the windows as the cops took me out of school, um, being listed in the what's it called, like the police blotter in the newspaper. I was 16. Um, like none of that means that I was headed for good things, um, or at least didn't think so at the time. But I really didn't know any other way, and I didn't really know what else to do. And I'm not even sure that I cared all that much. Um, but that arrest and the introduction into a rehab for teens, not the first time that I had a brush with a rehab, but that time was more it was more necessary because at that time the law was saying, hey, you need to straighten up. I had no intentions at that time of staying sober, or in fully embracing recovery. To be perfectly honest, my intentions were to get everyone off my back so that I could get out of trouble. The charges would get dropped. My parents might, trust me a little bit more. So I put on the charm and I did everything that I was supposed to do and followed the rules and was nice and polite. And what I kind of discovered was I liked it better than what I was wearing before. And it felt better, and life was a lot easier, and more people trusted me. And I was developing relationships with people in a 12-step community that seemed very real and fulfilling. And as a result, I stuck with it. Um, so that first day, May 3rd, 1996, was the first day that I was sober. And I've been sober since then through that rehab program and a 12-step group, and with a whole bunch of other people that have carried me when I really wasn't able to do it myself. So fast forward a bit, I was 100% abstaining from substances, like anything. As you know, the Finger Lakes region is the second biggest wine producing region in the nation. We have, I don't know, 600 breweries in our area. It's endless. So when I started doing Exploring Upstate and get a girlfriend that wants to go for a day trip into the Finger Lakes, do a wine tasting, as someone who was in recovery, who didn't drink, like a lot of times I would just stand there and have water. While I was exploring upstate and going out and seeing these places, there was a ton of wineries and breweries that had nothing for me. And I started to resent it a little. Honestly, it sucked. So it was probably, I don't know, 2012, 2013. I think my dad was the one who told me that Wagner Winery has a grape juice, and it's in this really nice, attractive bottle. And I was like, oh, this is cool. Like I can drink this and kind of feel like I'm an adult. And I thought, I wonder how many other places have products like this. There's got to be more. So I made it a point to scour the Finger Lakes for everyone that was producing a non-alcoholic option. And on Exploring Upstate, and at some point, maybe 2014 or 15, I published what I called the non-wine trail. It was those places that were making things. And it's always been something that I've loved and has resonated with me and has been important to me. But it wasn't something that I focused on exclusively because I had Exploring Upstate. When
Can I just
20,
take a step back real quick?
yeah, dude, because I feel bad that I'm just going on and on and on.
You're doing great, Chris. I'm the one who asked the question that spanned over multiple decades. It's my bad. But I guess one of the things that I'm kind of curious about is like before we get into this project, and I really appreciate like you use the term "feel like an adult," when you're at these places, which is something that I very much identify with, and I'll explain that later. But I'm kind of curious about. I'm going to keep using this push pull analogy, but like as somebody who thankfully found recovery at a very young age, like some people never find it. Some people find it in their 50s. Some people find it in their 30s. Like you found it when you were 16. How has I guess how has that, I don't know, that struggle been something that you've recognized moving forward? Like, did you find yourself, pulled or intrigued with alcohol and substance use kind of like 10 years after that, 15 years after that? Or was it something where like you had felt like cold turkey, you really made that change and it felt good and it was something that was like inevitably a part of your personality and a part of your, internal workings?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's a difficult one to answer. Um, the short answer is there have absolutely 100% been moments in my life where I've thought, damn, it'd be really cool to smoke a joint with somebody. Or wouldn't it be cool that if I was at this place that served wine, that I could try a wine flight to see what it's like? I think what's dangerous about that for me is that inability to achieve balance. There have been a lot of people over the years who have said to me, like, you're probably not an alcoholic. You're probably a stupid kid who did a lot of stupid things. And maybe there's some truth to that. I don't know that I've ever admitted that publicly on a recording before, um, but I'm feeling bold enough to say that now. There might be some truth to that. I have no idea. But I also know that if I test those waters and I find out that I'm wrong, man, I got a lot to lose. Um, I've built I've built some really important relationships. I've got a good career. I have the trust of my family and my loved ones. People come to me now for help. I'm in a good position. So I don't feel like testing those waters and saying, hey, I can go do a wine tasting at such and such winery is going to add value to my life beyond what I'm currently doing now. So I don't feel like I need to. What I also have experienced, which might, I guess, be adjacent to your question, is not wanting to feel. Um, I believe that a lot of the reasons that I sought out those experiences with substances was emotionally and mentally. I sometimes don't like sitting in those places and I want to get away from it. So you mentioned earlier on in this episode that sometimes you can do that with work. I don't believe that addiction is about an individual substance. So, if somebody's suffering from alcoholism, alcohol is just a tiny, tiny little portion of that ism. The ism is really about escape and not wanting to be with ourselves. I've totally found in the time that I've been sober is that I can, in an unbalanced way, find other things to use that escape, and those things also become unhealthy, whether it's going to the gym too often and trying to achieve some goal there where I shirk my responsibilities and only focus on that, whether it's work. I think probably exploring upstate probably did that to an extent. You asked earlier about how to like create a schedule and how to manage all that. Yeah, I threw myself into it 100%. It was the only thing that I focused on. Um, so I think that ism is a part of who I am as a person, regardless of the substance. And that's something that I've tried to always be mindful of.
I really appreciate you being so transparent about that and kind of putting that out there. I mean, I don't know how listeners are responding to this, obviously, because I'm not staring at them. But for me in general, like it's something that I think about a lot in the sense that like, um, for listeners out there, like Chris and I were talking before, like I'm a straight edge dude. I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't do anything. It's never necessarily appealed to me, but I definitely have addictive tendencies. And I sit there and I look at the way in which, I repeatedly, take on some sort of action or some sort of responsibility or some sort of habit and then keep doing the thing and then notice that it's destructive toward my own personal relationships or my own personal productivity or myself. And maybe I ask myself, is this a problem 2 years later or 6 months later? I don't let myself deal with those things. And I just think it's important to recognize that, like, we as a society so easily identify drug and alcohol addiction as like, this is something that needs to be treated, or this is something that's getting in the way of personal relationships, or this is a thing where there's systems for people to kind of figure it out. But in reality, a lot of people are dealing with these types of uh I don't know, like urgencies or needs or whatever they are on a regular basis, whether it relates to coffee or the food that they're eating or toxic relationships in their lives or a need to feel included. Like these are things that
Shopping, gambling, sex, relationships. Yeah, it's the list of imbalances is endless.
it's crazy. And I just, not that this is not me inferring that all of us have problems that we need to solve today, but I think it's important that those parallels are there. The other thing I just wanted to kind of transition into before we talk about non-rockaholic is I want to talk about the sort of like culture of alcohol for adults. Just going back to your comment of like, being at a winery and like, I don't really feel like an adult sitting here drinking water. And I'm kind of curious about like your relationship with that idea. Because like one of the questions I have written down, and maybe we'll tackle this later, is like, for a guy who doesn't drink and a guy who's in recovery, you spend a ton of time in bars.
Yeah, I probably do. Maybe not a ton, but I definitely spend enough time there. I think I probably have a very unique upbringing with alcohol because I was done before I could even legally drink. So I was going to bars at 18 to like go see music, or 21 to go see music, but I wasn't drinking at that time. I didn't have all of the same um, experiences that everybody else had with alcohol as they were growing up. So it's I guess it's kind of the only thing that I've known since getting sober. And I'm perfectly comfortable going to a winery. Like I don't at all walk into a winery and think, oh my God, and get anxious. But what I do have is a desire to feel like there's something for me there rather than um, just being there because the person I'm with wants to go to this place. Um, we have, I don't want to say an unhealthy obsession with alcohol in this region, but like I mentioned before, alcohol is basically the Finger Lakes. Wine, beer, mead, cider, it's all alcohol. And we've kind of drafted our entire tourism model in the Finger Lakes around alcohol. So for someone who doesn't drink, if you say like, hey, you should go on a drive around Seneca Lake, and like, okay, what should I do? Well, there's all these wineries. Like, all right, so what else is there? And in some ways, um, there's not a lot else. I can give you a long list of things that you can do in between, but the average person, all we see is wineries. So we kind of have an obsession with those things. I mentioned earlier about finding that there was a number of places that were producing non-alcoholic options. So I began to focus on those. So I'm totally comfortable going to, like I mentioned, Wagner, because they make their own root beer at the brewery and they make their own blush grape juice at the winery. So if I'm with someone who wants to go on a winery or brewery tour, I'll totally go because I can hang out and chill and I can feel like I'm doing the same thing that they are.
I love it. Well, let's talk about non-rockaholics, shall we? So, for people who are unfamiliar with your website, your brand, your social media presence, what is it?
That's a good question. I think it's probably changing and evolving all the time. What it is was so I mentioned kind of feeling exhausted and overwhelmed with exploring upstate and feeling like it was a great time to put a cap on that. And I did nothing, Ryan. Like for like 2 years, I did nothing. I worked and I went to the gym and I hung out with my friends. And I would still like I still go on road trips. Like I still go out and drive places and go see things and go to lunch and do that stuff. But I did nothing creative. And I kept waiting for the moment to strike me that I was like, hey, I should do this, or maybe I'll do some freelance writing for some other publication or something. And none of it really felt right. And I, it was me. I think I decided it was like 10 o'clock at night, and I was probably laying in bed watching TV, but also on my phone. And I was like, let me create an Instagram account to share the like non-alcoholic drinks that I have. And it was probably, I mean, the initial thought was mostly it was just for me to sort of keep track of all the things that I was exploring. Um, and somehow people started like liking it and following it, and more people started liking it. And I was like, I guess there's more people who are interested in this than just me. And then I wanted to create a resource for people who wanted that information. And I think it's kind of, so to answer your question, what is it? I think it's kind of a twofold resource. One, I know for a fact that there are some people who follow me because I am sober and in recovery, and they appreciate that. And then there are some people who aren't sober and in recovery, but they're interested in non-alcoholic drinks. So it's kind of this weird mix up of recovery and sobriety, but also interesting stuff to drink.
I love it. And like I'm really curious about the sort of behind the scenes of this because it's like, how do I say this? Maybe I have an addiction to band t-shirts. And like the last few days, like I don't know, I got this band from Japan I really like. I finally have a hoodie of theirs. Life is good. And then tomorrow another one will arrive and whatever, and I'll just be the most fashionable person. But you do these unboxings of like so many non-alcoholic products that like it's baffling to me. Like, just some stats, kind of looking it up real quick. I think it was as of February 2024, it's estimated that like the non-alcohol or low alcohol product market is $11 billion. I mean, that's a huge, huge market. And like
It's absurd.
it's absurd. And like for me that's like, okay, cool, like I'm excited to find a new craft soda when I go to Cracker Barrel, as opposed to like, this whole idea that like there really is this gigantic movement of people creating alcohol-free bars, and all these alcohol producers creating alcohol-free versions of beverages that people have become really reliant or comfortable on, or that it gives them some sense of routine, and they can transition their routine to remove themselves from alcohol. But going back to just my comment about like your unboxing a video of what was it? It was something like 20 some odd products from Canada, I think was the one that I was looking at.
Yeah, it was
Um,
probably a box of beers. Yeah.
yeah, like tell me about like your sort of research process in regards to finding these types of things. Let's start there.
Yeah. 10 years ago, if I was interested in, or which I was, if I was to start an account that was interested in non-alcoholic options, there were very few to discuss. I said that I scoured the Finger Lakes. It didn't take that long because there's not that many. Um, Somewhere around 2018, 2019, a bunch of businesses started saying, hey, maybe this is something that we really want to invest in. Athletic Brewing Company is a non-alcoholic brewery. They're probably at this point the household name of non-alcoholic beer. They were founded in 2017, so not that long ago, but earlier than the boom, which happened kind of post, and I want to say post COVID, but I'm not even really sure that I know when COVID ended because I don't think it kind of did. It just sort of petered off. But I think what happened, or at least what I've read and seen interviews with people, what happened was in COVID, everyone was locked at home and couldn't go anywhere. And people were like, well, I guess I'll have a drink when it was 1 in the afternoon. And I think some people developed an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. And maybe that doesn't necessarily mean that all those folks were alcoholics, but they developed some unhealthy habits and were out of balance. And not long after COVID, when we started to emerge into the real world again, people are like, hey, wait a second. Like, I think that I need to make some changes. And that's when everything started. You mentioned the non-alcoholic bottle shops popping up all over the country. People started creating these non-alcoholic beverage companies. I think the most important indicator that the trend is headed in the upward movement is that alcohol companies started investing in non-alcoholic options. Since in the time that I've been sober, every once in a while, you recognize that it becomes cool to be sober because there's a celebrity. I think John Larroquette was one that I remember. He even had a show, I think, where he played himself as someone who was recovering from alcoholism. And like, it was kind of cool to be sober for a little bit, but no one was really investing in it until now. When you see things like Guinness came out with their own non-alcoholic Guinness Stout maybe 2 years ago, or maybe it was last year. What Guinness is realizing is we stand to lose market share unless we do this. Corona just did the same thing last summer. They released a non-alcoholic beer, and what they're saying is we own the market share of people who want our product, but we're finding that there are so many people that want a non-alcoholic version of our product that if we don't get in this game, we're going to start to lose. So I think that's one of the most important indicators of the growth of the market, is that these for-profit alcohol companies are saying, hang on. We want a piece of this pie too. And as a result, like, the options that are available have exponentially multiplied by like hundreds of a percent, like every couple months. It's really insane to see.
And, I mean, to put it in perspective, like, I'm just pulling up an old message that we had sent, which is, as of a few days ago, you had drank 189 different types of non-alcoholic beer this year.
Yeah, just this year. Yeah. It's the same. I mean, dude, it's the same as anything else that we were talking about. Like, anything can become an obsession, like 200 pinball machines or like however many t-shirts. And I don't, I imagine that there may be someone listening to this who are like, dude, you're not addicted to non-alcoholic beer. And I'm not saying that I am. But what I'm saying is, I think creative people get super attached to a passion, and it makes us feel so good that that's really all we want to focus on. So I'm not drinking like a 6 pack of non-alcoholic beer every day. Usually one, maybe not even one a day. But I am loving so much the discovery of all of these new options that are available that I want to try them all. So I'm going for it.
I mean, just to think that there's almost you have tried almost 200 different versions in 2024. Like, 10 years ago, I'm not sure you could have found 200 different non-alcoholic beer options. Like, I don't think that would exist.
We had St. Pauli's Girl. Shout out for a local company, Genesee, started making an NA in the early 90s. There was very few Beck's, O'Doul's. What we're seeing in the last 3 to 4 years is insane. And not just, it's not just all like ales and lagers. Like, there's really interesting double hopped IPAs and stouts, and it's an interesting menu of options that you couldn't even fathom a handful of years ago.
And also the last thing I want to kind of point out in this one, which I just is the thing that I've been really curious about, is the rise of the mocktail, which has been really interesting in the sense that, like, when this is weird coming from a straight edge dude, but like when you go to a bar, from what I understand, if you're ordering like a cocktail, you want the taste is interesting, but the process of watching the bartender make it is also part of what you're purchasing. Like that experience, that show, that like I remember going to a rooftop bar in Oswego a year or so ago, and the
Dude,
bartender.
that's a cool place.
I know. I heard you. I heard your interview talking about that. But there's a rooftop bar there that overlooks Lake Ontario. That's really awesome. And I was there with a friend who's a regular, and he walks in, and the bartender is like, "You need to try this." And he's like, "Oh, it's really interesting." And she had been spending a lot of time figuring out the best way to infuse smoke into her beverages, and had like come up with this whole thing. But we're now at a point where I've been, prior to this interview, one of my research procedures has been looking at the restaurants I go to and see how many of them are listing sort of higher end mocktails on their menu, and it's a growing margin, where the process of a bartender choosing to make something, or the server being able to elaborately explain the types of ingredients or the way in which this is made, is a part of that process. And I'm kind of curious, just like as somebody who's really in this space a lot, like what are your observations about mocktail culture at this point in time?
That it's muddy. And that one, I think people are confused about it. And two, people aren't really sure what it is. So to your point about the kind of the craft experience, that's what bothered me 10 years ago about going to, a winery or a brewery, and they'd be like, we got this can of Sprite. And I'm like, well, I guess it's wet and it's cold and I can drink it, but it's not really interesting. I'm in like the second largest producer of craft beverages in the nation. Like the best you got is a Sprite. So I think now there are people who are saying, you know what? You can do some pretty interesting things without alcohol. And maybe it takes a little bit more work, but there's some artistry here. And I'm interested in trying to make it happen. A lot of people are not interested. There are plenty of restaurants who, or bars, or, wherever, taverns that are not interested. And that's totally cool. A few years ago, there's a local radio show here on WXXI in Rochester called Connections. And a couple of friends of mine were guests on it, and they were talking about vegan options. And they were basically saying, like, one of them is a restaurant owner, and basically he was saying, if you don't have a vegan option on your menu, people who want vegan food are not going to come there. And if you're okay with that, that's totally okay. Like a vegan has to be okay with a brewer or a barbecue pit saying, we don't do vegan food. And if you're okay with losing that customer, that's fine. 10 years ago, somebody who didn't drink alcohol, you weren't losing them as a customer. We were just putting up with whatever you had. At this point, people are just not choosing to go to those places because we can go over here and get something really interesting. So I think that there are some of those restaurant owners and hospitality employees who are saying, much like Corona and Guinness, if we don't get in on this, we stand to lose a part of the market share, and maybe it's going to impact our bottom line as a business. But I do think that there are some people who are leaning into it as an art and as a craft. And those folks are enjoying it, and the customers are enjoying it because we didn't get that before.
It's pretty cool. It's been a neat transition, just sort of like uh be going out and being somebody who has never ever looked at the alcohol menu. That's not true. I actually quite like going to restaurants and looking at where things are from, and price tags, so I can giggle at them and then say I'll pay my mortgage instead. But but it is also really cool to go and feel a little more included when I go to a restaurant. There's a new Peruvian place that just opened in Syracuse that we went to for my mom's birthday, and as we're there, I wasn't planning on checking out the menu, and there's a little M at the top, and I was like, "What's that?" And I was like, "Oh, I have to try this. Like this is a type of beverage, and am terrible at describing foods, and I can't even describe what the mocktail was at this point. But it was a combination of things that had, like basil and lemon and all these other components that I wasn't expecting to be on a brand new restaurant. But clearly, this restaurateur like understands the clientele and understands that like just when you do anything, the splash you make, you need to make sure you're reeling in as many people as possible. And having a mocktail menu as part of your greater menu that's very thoughtfully implemented is gonna bring in more people than you might have otherwise.
Totally agree. And again, I'm sympathetic to any restaurant that says, you know what, we don't do that, and I don't really want to do that, and that's totally fine. But I'm not going to go there. And guess what? As the designated driver for some of my friends who drink, I'm not going to be driving them there either. So you don't just end up losing me as a customer, you end up losing the people that I'm with as well. So that's why I think that there are enough people at this point wanting those non-alcoholic craft experiences that soon we're going to find that restaurants will have no choice but to get on board. And by the way, like the conversation about a mixologist standing behind the bar and putting together something really thoughtfully and artistic is super cool, and I'm happy to pay for it. But it's not necessary anymore. If you're a winery and you don't want to have a de-alcoholized wine because you're afraid you're just going to sell one glass and the rest of the bottle is going to go to waste, they've got little individual size cans. There are mocktails in a can. You can put them in their cooler and they'll stay there for 6 months. You can do it really lazy and still get away with it. But still, I think there's going to be people who aren't on board. And again, that's cool. I think there's probably enough customers to go around for both types of places. But those non-alcoholic, so like there's only a couple non-alcoholic bottle shops in upstate New York. There's one in Schoharie, there's one here in Rochester, and one in Buffalo. And they're doing really, really well. And it's not like those people just didn't exist before. It's because we didn't have the option, so we couldn't go those places. So if you're a for-profit business selling alcohol, that's where some of your customers are going if you don't have them.
Yeah, and I guess I'm figuring out how to make this statement exactly, but like we've talked a lot about COVID and the sort of mental shift that happened, and one of the things that I don't think gets talked enough about is that a lot of people felt that they lost their sense of community in that time period, and they're trying to find it. So if you're someone who's listening to this and you're thinking about the idea that like, oh, I'd never really thought about the idea that, like as somebody who doesn't drink, like I don't have that afternoon like beer that I'm going to get before I go home or something like that. Like there are people like you out there that are also looking for that community. And if you're, you want to do a meetup or you want to try to create your own place, like there's a whole arsenal of individuals who are looking for places to go. And creating non-alcoholic spaces is a really great way to start.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised at how many people were interested. Like I said, I launched that Instagram account and figured it would be easier for me because way fewer people would be interested than exploring upstate. So there would be less work, less notifications, less responses, and that's been the case. But it's been way more than I thought. And to your point about the meetups, I've had some people reach out and say, I don't know anybody else who's sober, and I'd love to meet some people. How do I do that in Rochester? So we started a meetup back in the summer. So like we've got a monthly meetup that we go to a different place that has an exceptional non-alcoholic menu, and people are building relationships with other sober folks, which is meaningful, and I hope gives some meaning and depth to the non-rockaholic creation that isn't just me saying, look at this cool ale from Canada, but it's helping to create some of that community, and not just for other people, but I'm aware that I definitely needed to.
Awesome. Well, my last question before we start to wrap things up is, again, Happy New Year, Chris. We, a lot of people are focused on this time of year about changing their habits or developing new ones. And Dry January is a movement that has gained a lot of traction over the years. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Dry January.
Yeah. So I've looked up the history of Dry January, and there are multiple organizations and countries who have all claimed to have invented it years apart. So I have no idea who the actual first Dry January one was, but I can tell you the one that was probably the most influential in making it happen was a medical group in, I think it was Europe, who was calling attention to cancer and basically saying, hey, after a month in December of holiday parties and New Year's Eve parties and drinking, like maybe you take a month to dry out and no alcohol, kind of reset your life, reset your body, regain some of your physical composure, and maybe in February you start drinking again. And what's happened is each year more and more people have committed to Dry January. And it's gotten way popular than I ever would have anticipated, to the point where now there's Dry July, which was a cancer organization in Canada that started that. There's Sober October. There's No Low November. People are coming up with all these ways to say, I want a month of resetting. And I think what's happening is there's this interesting crossover between people who are in recovery from addiction, who are sober all the time, and people who are just saying, you know what, I don't have a serious problem with alcohol, but maybe I just need a little break and a quick reset. And some of those populations are sort of crossing over with each other, and people are being more mindful of their choices around alcohol. And Dry January is a big part of that. So obviously today is the first day, and the idea is that you will go the entire month of January without drinking any alcohol. And typically what people find, what's reported, is that you end up sleeping better, you have more energy, your head is a bit clearer. When you start looking much deeper into the science and the health behind drinking and giving up drinking, you end up finding that going longer than a month, it will have an impact on body fat and ability to digest food, and a whole long list of things that have long-term effects on your health. But the short term, people are like, you know what, this feels kind of good. I got a buddy who parties pretty hard. And back in, maybe it was a year ago, whenever it was somewhere through like halfway October, he told me, he goes, yeah, I'm doing Sober October. And I was kind of blown away because I never would have anticipated him saying that he was doing it. And he goes, I got to be honest, I have no idea like how much I was actually drinking until I stopped. And I did not anticipate to feel this good after just a couple of weeks. So I think a lot of people are discovering that, and that's why more and more people are jumping on the Dry January campaign.
I love it. And I think that, I don't think it's too far of a stretch to say that if you're somebody who is listening to this, and through this whole conversation are evaluating unhealthy habits that you have or habits that you want to change, like Dry January does not just have to relate to alcohol. It can relate to, just changing your life in some way that you think is going to make it better for you. And I support it. Chris supports it. We want you to start 2025 in a physical and a mental place that you're happy about.
Yeah, I think we're going to need all the energy that we can muster to get through 2025. So I want to be well rested and ready.
Awesome. So, Chris, for anybody who is interested in following your work, where are the best places to find you?
Instagram and Facebook and the website are all the same. It's nonrockaholic.com, which was just a pun between non-alcoholic and my home here in Rochester that everyone abbreviates as rock. So on Instagram and Facebook, it's non-rockaholic.
Awesome. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for making time for this. I always want to end each episode just making space for anything that might be on your mind or anything that we haven't covered. Is there anything that you want to kind of put out there before we depart?
No, I think we covered a lot. Speaking of resting, we, we've delved into a lot, and I really appreciate you giving me an opportunity to share my personal story. I've always been taught since the day I got sober. I've always been taught that the only way to keep what we have is to give it away. So whenever somebody hands me an opportunity to talk about my story, I jump at it, because if there's one person who's on the fence thinking like, man, my relationship with alcohol or drugs is not good and I don't really know what to do about it or where to go, if I can help just one person off that fence, then I feel like I'm in good shape.
Well, I love it. And here, Happy New Year, Chris. Here is to hoping that everybody has an amazing 2025.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Chris, thanks so much for coming on the show and for starting the new year with me. I feel like the mutual need for balance is probably something that a lot of people are on the hunt for. And from me to Chris to all of you in the podcast realm, I hope you all find balance in 2025. Looking ahead, though, I've got some cool stuff coming forward, and I have to be upfront that the podcast guests that I've been lining up are just making my year magical already. On January 15th, I get to talk to one of my favorite writers of all time. For episode 39, Richard Christian Matheson is going to be on the show. In my own personal world, he is somebody that I know as a horror writer. He wrote the novel Created By. He is a short story writer that I would always pick up in different anthologies. But in the sort of mass scope of his writing, he's actually a much more popular and successful screenwriter. He wrote the screenplay for the movie 3 O'Clock High in the 1980s, as well as Stephen King's Battleground. He is also just known as being the head writer or a lead writer for a ton of amazing TV shows, sort of in the 70s and 80s. The A-Team, Amazing Stories, Tales from the Crypt, Knight Rider, Three's Company, The Incredible Hulk, just to name a few, on top of dozens and dozens of other projects. Richard Christian Matheson, or RC as he's known, is going to be on the show sharing his writing experiences, talking about his writing legacy, and just sort of talking about the creative process. Plus, we get some really fun insights into his sort of magic world as a drummer. So if you're interested in that, tune in on January 15th to the Meditations with Ryan Zlomek podcast, and there will be an awesome interview for you. If you're looking for more listening in the interim, you can take a look at my back catalog. On episode 4, I talk with tattoo artist Jamie Santos about her process and opening her own tattoo shop. On episode 15, we talk about children's hospitals with Daniel Spoler, who created the charity Project Pinball that puts pinball machines in places where people are experiencing high stress as a means to sort of build community within those spots and give some sort of distraction. On episode 17, I've got Julie Sellers on the show. She's a creative business advisor based in Tennessee and does an amazing job of just talking about the way in which we can solve problems in the entrepreneurial space. On episode 28, we talk with Greg Bennick, who was the lead singer of the band Trial, but more famously is known as a keynote speaker and a professional juggler. And if you're looking for more Central New York food, episode 33, we've got Joel Capolongo, the owner of Strong Hearts Cafe, which is an all-vegan eatery that is known all across the world. As always, I just want to say how much I appreciate your support of this show. This would not exist if it wasn't for the listeners, so thank you for being out there. And I have a request. Every time I look at the analytics for this show, I see that I have listeners in places that I've never been able to visit, states that I've never traveled to, countries that I've never gone to, and I'm very curious who you are. If you're somebody who's a repeated listener, please send me an email, meditations@ryanzlomek.com, just to tell me who you are and what kind of episodes you like. I'm very intrigued with how you found my show and how it's impacting you, because it's pretty awesome on my end to sit there and realize that these really cool stories have made their way across the globe. So do not hesitate to reach out. If you're interested in seeing what other stuff I'm up to, you can also find me on social media at Ryan Zlomek on Instagram and TikTok, The World of Ryan Zlomek on Facebook, and again, you can just email me meditations@ryanzlomek.com. And with that, it's time for us to wrap up. Thanks for coming and joining me for another conversation. You're awesome. You're going to do amazing things in 2025. Go change the world. I dare you. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to make space for conversation because you just might learn something.